American Prestige watchers, listeners, all those things. It's Derek. I'm joined as always by my friend and comrade Danny Bester, and we're here for another of our weekly Q&A sessions. Danny, I don't know if you know how this works, but for those who don't know how it works, first of all, you have to subscribe to American Prestige.
Number one,
most
most
doing
important.
anyway. Yeah, number one. Once you're subscribed to American Prestige, you can join our Discord. And once you've done that, you can ask us questions. And we pick one question every week to answer here on video so everyone can see our wonderful faces after a night of not great sleep, apparently, in this case, in either case. Then you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, which helps us out, and share the videos and tell more people about the show, and all good things will flow from that. So this week, Danny, we have a question from Tayseer. How do liberal internationalists reconcile their self-perception as defenders of liberalism with their blatant and repeated disregard for international law, human rights, and democracy in the context of U.S. actions abroad? To what extent are liberal internationalists genuinely to their professed ideals versus deeply employing liberal rhetoric to legitimize and maintain U.S. primacy? Is there much ideological and practical difference between figures like Samantha Power and Henry Kissinger?
It's a good question. So I think that to some degree, there's always going to be a tension between the exercise of power and liberal ideology. And this is something that many people who study international relations or who study politics have long identified, that one could have a particular belief in rationality or law or what have you. But when one actually exercises power, their own interests wind up winning out. You could see this as recently as Joe Biden pardoning Hunter, right? And various other Biden family members for crimes that may or may not have been committed in the last 10 or so years. That's just a very clear situation in which liberals allow themselves to identify what the right-wing cum Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt identified as a state of exception, that those who have power are allowed to determine when they are able to step outside of the law. And I think that that's really where it comes down to, is that in the actual exercise of power in historical time, liberals have long arrogated to themselves the ability to identify when it is legitimate to step outside of the law. Oftentimes, and I think this is what makes liberals unique in the purpose and service of quote unquote saving liberalism. So I think that is the rhetoric that has primarily identified the liberal internationalist approach since it really got off the ground institutionally with Woodrow Wilson, is that when Wilson is enacting the Alien Enemies Act or the Sedition Act or allowing the Palmer raids to go on, et cetera, what he's doing is saying that this is in the purpose for the purpose of saving liberalism. This is what happened after the end of the Cold War. This is what I wrote my first book, Democracy in Exile, on, is that people created a system, not people, liberals created a system of foreign policy decision making that stood almost totally outside the democratic process. In this case, I'm referring to the quote unquote military intellectual complex, the network of think tanks and academic centers that to some degree serve as the brain of the national security state. People understood that this was not related to democracy. It was not subject to public opinion whatsoever. It was kind of subject to congressional opinion in the sense that the money that was spent on them was often funneled through the military. And they did at some point in the late 1950s come under attack when Rand analyst published a book called Strategic Surrender, and some law was passed that the U.S. government couldn't fund defeatist texts. But regardless, when liberals were creating this type of parastatal organization, the Rand Corporation and groups that came after that, they understood that this wasn't totally democratic. But they justified it by arguing that the United States was in an existential struggle with the Soviet Union specifically and communism writ large, and that due to this fact of existential struggle, due to this crisis, they were able to step outside normal liberal functioning in order to ensure that liberalism was in the long term saved. And that obviously derives from the experience of the interwar period. A lot of these people had direct experience in Germany. Either they were themselves German or they had been to Germany in the 30s and had a particular view of Nazism as having triumphed because the opposition didn't take necessary measures. And so that's how they justified it. They would literally say, when the Cold War ends, democratic functioning could return to normal. The problem, of course, is that when the Cold War ended, you don't actually get a return to normal. You get the institutionalization of anti-democratic practices.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's just such a surprise. And I think that's the place that liberalism itself has found itself. You see, after the end of the Soviet Union, instead of making foreign policy more democratic, or at least looking into how to do that, what winds up happening is that liberals just search for another enemy. In the 1990s, it was the responsibility to protect. After 9/11, they obviously got on board with the Bush administration's global war on terror, Obama's pivot to Asia, and today everyone's talking about China. So instead of actually reforming itself and making itself more democratic, liberalism, what have you, have actually just tried to search for new justifications in order to continue to arrogate to themselves when they could decide the state of exception. So I think they believe it. I think, like, Samantha Power believes that she's doing good when she's at the UN or USAID, and that she's doing the best she could within a system that's unjust. But the problem is, in actual practice, it's a very illiberal project to some degree to be an empire. And that is, of course, the political scientist Patrick Porter's argument that I think his book is called The False Promise of Liberal Order. And he just makes the point that world ordering as a project is inherently illiberal. So there are some fundamental tensions there with the exercise of power and liberalism that are never going to be reconciled, and in the breach are almost always decided in favor of the exercise of power. So yeah, Derek, sorry, that was a bit much, but what are your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think Jacob Backrack, who I interact with on Twitter sometimes, and has been on the show before. Actually, we talked about the new chronology. Yeah, I remember that episode. I was in the middle of a power outage. Actually, I was on my phone. That was a banner episode. But he always says, he always often tweets, none of the defenders of Western civilization has ever encountered it, and I feel the same way about the defenders of the liberal world order. They've never actually encountered a liberal world order, but they're defending it anyway. I think you're right. I mean, I think what people sort of are conditioned to believe about the folks running the empire, and this may be because of popular culture or who knows, but they're conditioned to think that somebody like Antony Blinken goes to work every day and puts on a fake mustache to twirl as he imagines, the destruction of the world or whatever, the aggrandizement of the United States at the expense of the downtrodden peoples. And that's not, psychologically, that's not how people work. You find a way to convince yourself that you're doing the right thing, even if you may have doubts internally. Cognitive dissonance is a real thing. You always find a way to convince yourself that what you're doing is right and just. And I think for these people, for Samantha Power, for Blinken, for Jake Sullivan, I mean, there are degrees of it. We can talk about Kissinger, who approaches this in a different way. It gets to some of the, many of the same places, obviously. But for the folks who believe in some mythical liberal order that upholds, human rights, that upholds humanitarian aid for people who need it, all of those things, they still think that what they're doing is a necessary evil in the sacrifice of, or in the service of that greater good. And if you push them hard enough, the response is, we've had people too on this show, really. But the response is always, well, who do you want to run the world? Do you want China to run the world? Do you want Russia to run the world? Because it's just going to be worse. So you claim to believe are just going to be worse if one of these other countries is the hegemon. I think the problem is there's no ability to look past that, and you get into like some very Pollyannish ideas about international institutions and build world system that constrains the power of the nation state. And I'm not saying that we can do that necessarily, at least on a short-term horizon or short enough term for it to matter. But there is this, I think, on the part of even the people who have some grander global purpose, there's to look beyond the notion that some countries always got to be at the top of the heap, and it might as well be the United States, because at least we say these things, even if we don't always act in their interest. We claim to believe them. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. I know it's frustrating to watch all these guys do the things that they do and say the things that they say and have them never align with one another. But I think you have to look at it through the lens of, they feel like if they don't do what they're doing, things would be worse.
Yeah, and I think that has been the justification of Americans, specifically liberal empire. Other imperial systems in the past would make similar arguments in terms of they need to lead history, that progressive change depends upon them. But there's a particularly liberal tenor to American global hegemony that I do think makes it unique, and it does emerge from the fact that it really it was the liberals who institutionalized the empire, whether you're talking about Harry S. Truman or Dwight D. Eisenhower or John F. Kennedy. That first 15 years after the Cold War, these were liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans when it comes to Eisenhower there. So I think that is basically how they do it, and this is why today you don't see what one might. It seems like obvious, given the failures of U.S. foreign policy, that there would be some real reexamination of the tenets of American empire, and it just doesn't happen, because there's really, and this gets into the thing I've been arguing about imperialist realism, there's an inability to even think beyond the empire that is very interesting, and it's difficult to know precisely why that is the case, though I'm exploring it in this forthcoming piece. But I think that's where we are. And I think that's going to actually have negative effects for the world, because people aren't going to make necessary changes to deal with obviously material realities, like the declining share of the United States, or really the G7 of global GDP, the quote unquote rise of China in East Asia, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what makes this moment such a frustrating one to think and write about foreign policy, is that liberals cannot really do the self-examination necessary to make the changes that they have been able to make in the past, and that were part of the strength of liberalism. There's a famous article by the historian Gary Gersel called "The Protein Character of American Liberalism." And what he says is that what makes American liberalism so powerful is that it's able to incorporate change and incorporate criticism, and did it during the New Deal. And one could argue it even did it in the 80s and 90s, incorporating the right-wing critique. And it's enabled to do so now. And so that leads to a larger question about the crisis of liberalism that everyone has been talking about, and all of those good things.
How do you put somebody like Kissinger, or let's a pure realist like Mearsheimer, or the folks who challenge to some degree the liberal internationalist school, and yet at the same think, I mean, certainly on the subject of primacy, like Mearsheimer is a little bit different, although he's very much on China, for example. He's
hawkish,
very much a primacist. So where do you kind of put some of the other thinkers or schools in relation to the liberal internationalists?
Well, I think they're reacting against it. I mean, quote unquote realists, and particularly when you're talking about Kissinger, who actually, was in very powerful political positions. His realism doesn't necessarily survive his encounter with being someone who is actually making political choices. But when you're talking about Mearsheimer, I mean, it's a reaction. He's influenced by people like Hans Morgenthau, the quote unquote classical realist, whose Politics Among Nations really got international relations realism going in the late 1940s. People like Kenneth Waltz, people like John Hertz and others, who were essentially arguing against a Wilsonian, what they termed idealism, which thought that rules and rationality would be able to tame international relations. And Mersheimer argues and realists in general argue for various reasons, whether it's the structure of the international system, so-called international anarchy, the fact that there's not a police power at the level of the globe, or whether it's human nature. Human beings naturally expand and have a will to dominate. I think it's called an animus dominandi, is what it's called, or dominandi. I forget the exact Latin. But they argue that rules and rationality will never be able to tame power politics. But at the same time, they're advocating in favor of an international empire. I mean, when Mersheimer is saying that the United States needs to do what it can to remain hegemonic in East Asia, he's in practice advocating in favor of the liberal American empire, as was Kissinger when he's making his various choices. I mean, so it's a blend. They even though Mersheimer writes a book against liberalism, to some degree, he has typical liberal American commitments, like many of us do, to law and rationality and reason. He would just say that in the realm of power politics that they don't function. To some degree, that's true. My own thinking is shaped by realism. I do think that the Bob Wright hope is unlikely to be realized. The hope in international law is unlikely to be realized in historical practice. Though I would probably say that's less due to the structure of the international system or to human nature, and more to capitalism and empire, and the particular political conditions that exist in the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I don't, like many political scientists might do, realists might do, attribute it to a type of unchanging structure, but to particular and contingent historical conditions, even as I do believe that the realist derision of international law is historically correct, at least at this moment.
So I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Again, thanks to Tayseer for questions. Thanks to all watching and for listening to and supporting the show. Like and subscribe to whatever you got going on. Leave a review if you can leave a good one. If you're not, keep it to yourself.
Forget about it.
Yeah. But as always, thanks. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks. We love you. Bye.